Welcome, weary traveler, to Gandalf's sleepy library. Come, sit beside me here in the quiet of the night. The fire burns low, casting gentle shadows upon the walls, and outside the wind whispers through the trees like a distant memory of darker times. Tonight, I wish to tell you of them. The Nazgûl, the Ringwraiths. Of all the servants of the enemy, none were more terrible than the 9 riders. Not the orcs with their shrieking hordes. Not the trolls with their brute strength. Not even the Balrogs, those spirits of fire and shadow, could match the Nazgûl for sheer, creeping dread. For the Nazgûl were once like you and me. They were men proud and powerful, who desired more than their mortal span would allow. And for that desire, they paid a price beyond imagining. So settle in, dear friend. Let the warmth of the fire comfort you, as I speak of cold things and shadow and servitude, of the 9 kings who became slaves. There is wisdom in the tale, if we are willing to learn from it. And perhaps, in understanding their fate, we may better appreciate the gift that mortality truly is. Let me take you back, far back, to the middle years of the second age of this world. Sauron had been defeated in a region, driven from his fair disguise as the Lord of Gifts, and forced to flee to the dark land of Mordor. But though his body was diminished and his plans laid bare, he still possessed the one ring, the master of all the other rings of power. And he still possessed the 9 rings for mortal men. You see, when Sauron taught the elven smiths of a region the craft of ring making, his ultimate goal was not merely to create beautiful things. It was to forge chains of power, chains of dominion, chains that would bind the free peoples of Middle-earth to his will. The 3 rings of the elves escaped his direct touch, remained pure in their purpose. The 7 rings of the dwarves proved resistant to his control, for the dwarves were made of sterner stuff than he had anticipated. But the 9 were made with one purpose alone: to enslave the race of men. Why men, you might ask? Why did Sauron craft these particular instruments of corruption for the race and for the mortals, rather than for any other people? The answer lies in the very nature of men themselves. Men are mortal. This is their defining characteristic, the thing that sets them apart from the elves and the dwarves, and all other speaking peoples. The elves live forever, unless slain by violence or consumed by grief. The dwarves live long, their lifespans measured in centuries rather than decades. But men are given a brief span upon this earth, a single lifetime to accomplish all that they will ever accomplish, and then they pass beyond the circles of the world to a fate that even the Valar do not know. This mortality is in truth a gift. Ildvater intended as such, a release from the weariness of the world, a freedom that even the immortal elves sometimes envy. But men do not always see it that way. They see their brief lives slipping away, see their loved ones aging and dying, see the works of their hands crumbling to dust, while the elves remain young and fair and eternal. And some men, the proudest and most ambitious, come to hate their mortality. They come to desire above all else to escape it. This desire is what Sauron exploited. The 9 rings were crafted to appeal to this deepest longing in the hearts of men. They promised life, endless life, life that would stretch on and on beyond the natural span. They promised power, the ability to command others, to shape the world according to one's will. They promised knowledge, the secrets of the unseen world, visions of things hidden from mortal sight. Everything that an ambitious man might desire, the rings seemed to offer. And so Sauron distributed them to the greatest lords among men. We do not know all of their names, these 9 doomed kings. The histories of that time are fragmentary, and much was lost in the cataclysms that followed. But we know something of who they were. These men who would become the most terrible servants of the Shadow. 3 of them were lords of Endor Menor itself, that great island kingdom of men that lay in the midst of the sea between Middle and the Undying Lands. These were princes of the highest bloodline, descendants of Elros Tar Minyatar, who was himself the son of Rendil and the brother of Elrond. They were among the mightiest men who ever lived, gifted with lifespans of centuries and the accumulated wisdom of generations. But even centuries were not enough for them. They wanted more. They wanted eternity. One of the 9 was said to be a king of the Easterlings, a ruler of vast realms in the lands beyond the Sea of Rogun. His people had never known the friendship of the elves or the blessing of the Valar. They knew only the struggle for survival in a harsh land, and they had grown strong in that struggle. Their king accepted Saur's ring eagerly, seeing in it a chance to extend his dominion over all the eastern lands. His name, in the tongue of his people, may have been Cal, though even this is uncertain. Others came from the south, from Harad and beyond, lords of proud peoples who had built great civilizations in the burning lands beneath the southern stars. These men were sorcerers as well as kings, practitioners of dark arts that they had learned from servants of Morgoth in ages past. The rings amplified their powers, made them more than they had ever been before. And so the 9 were assembled. 9 mortal men, 9 proud lords, 9 souls ripe for corruption. Now let me tell you how the corruption worked, for this is the most terrible part of the tale. The 9 did not become wraiths overnight. Their transformation was not a sudden change, not a dramatic moment of damnation. It was a slow erosion, a wearing away of everything that made them human, until nothing remained but shadow and servitude. This is how evil often works. My friend, it does not announce itself with trumps and banners. It creeps in slowly, disguised as something desirable, something beneficial. The rings seemed like gifts at first, and the lords who wore them must have believed that they had received the greatest treasures in all the world. In the beginning, the rings granted exactly what they promised: long life, first and foremost. The ring bearers ceased to age as other men age. Their hair did not grey, their faces did not wrinkle, their strength did not fail. Decades passed, and they remained vital and powerful while their contemporaries grew old and died, it must have seemed, in those early years. As though they had truly cheated death. Power, too. The rings enhanced the natural abilities of their bearers, made them more persuasive, more commanding, more able to bend others to their will. Lesser men fell under their sway, obeying without question, serving without complaint. The ring lords became tyrants over their own peoples, and their peoples loved them for it. And knowledge. The rings granted sight into the unseen world, that shadow realm that exists alongside the world of the living. The ring bearers could see things hidden from ordinary men, could perceive the movement of spirits and the currents of power that flow beneath the surface of reality. This knowledge made them seem wise beyond their years, made them seem almost divine. For a time, perhaps even for centuries, the 9 must have believed that they had made a good bargain. But the rings were not merely gifts, they were chains. And slowly, so slowly that the wearers did not notice, those chains began to tighten. The ring bearers did not truly cease to age. They simply began to fade. Year by year, century by century, they became less substantial. Their bodies, which had seemed so strong and vital, began to lose their solidity. They became translucent, then transparent, then invisible to ordinary sight. They were still there, still present, but they existed more in the shadow realm than in the world of the living. And as they faded, they became aware of Sauron. The One Ring was the master of the 9, and through it, Sauron could sense every one of his servants. He could feel their presence, could reach out and touch their minds, could whisper to them across vast distances. At first, this connection was subtle, barely noticeable. But as the ring bearers faded, as they became more attuned to the shadow realm, the connection grew stronger. Sauron's voice became louder in their minds. His will became harder to resist. They began to lose themselves. Names are powerful things, my friend. They anchor us to our identities, connect us to our families and our histories, remind us of who we are and where we came from. The ring bearers lost their names first. Not all at once, but gradually, that had once defined them became meaningless. They forgot their fathers' names, forgot their mothers' names, forgot the names of their children and their lovers and their friends. They forgot their own names, those sounds that had once meant so much, that had once summoned forth the full weight of their identities. They became simply the 9, numbers rather than names, interchangeable servants rather than unique individuals. Their memories went next, The ring-bearers forgot the faces of those they had loved, forgot the places where they had been happy, forgot the deeds they had accomplished before the rings came into their possession. Their entire past lives faded like dreams upon waking, leaving behind only a vague sense of loss, a hollow ache where identity had once resided. And then their wills. This was the final surrender, the complete capitulation to Sauron's dominion. The Nine ceased to have desires of their own, goals of their own, purposes of their own. They wanted only what Sauron wanted. They served only the will of the Dark Lord. They became extensions of his malice, instruments of his hatred, weapons that he'd wield against his enemies with terrible precision. They had sought to escape death, and they had succeeded. But what remained was not life. It was slavery, eternal and absolute. It was existence without joy, without hope, without even the memory of what those things had meant. They had become wraiths, the Nazgûl, the most pitiable and most terrible beings in all of Middle-earth. Let me speak now of what it means to be a wraith, for this is difficult for those who walk in the light to understand. The Nazgûl existed in a realm that most living beings never perceive, a shadow world that overlays our own like a second skin upon the earth. Imagine, if you can, a world without color, a world where everything is gray, where the brightest day appears as a dim twilight, and the darkest night as an impenetrable void. Imagine a world without warmth, where even fire provides no comfort, where cold seeps into the very core of your being and never lets go. Imagine a world without substance, where solid things are mere shadows and the living appear as flickering flames, painfully bright against the endless grey. This is the Wraith world, and this is where the Nazgûl dwelt. When the ring-bearers began to perceive this realm, it must have seemed like a gift, another benefit of the rings they wore. They could see things hidden from ordinary sight, could perceive the truth behind illusions, could track their enemies through barriers that would have stopped any mortal hunter. But as they faded further, as they passed more completely into the shadow realm, they discovered the terrible price of this perception. They could no longer see the world of the living as it truly was. To the Nazgûl, the sun was a painful brightness, a searing light that pierced their eyes and weakened their power. They could endure it, could function beneath it, but they were diminished during the day, lessened, uncomfortable. Only at night did they feel at ease. Only in darkness did they possess their full strength. They became creatures of shadow out of necessity, not merely preference. And the living to them appeared as flames in the darkness. Each living being, from the greatest king to the smallest insect, burned with the fire left light that was painful to perceive, and yet utterly fascinating. The brighter the flame, the more powerful the being. The Nazgûl could sense the life force of their enemies from great distances, could track the ring-bearer across hundreds of miles by the peculiar light that he carried. But they could not feel that fire themselves. They were cold, always cold, a chill that went deeper than bone, deeper than soul. They were drawn to warmth but could never possess it. They could kill the living, could extinguish those flames, but they could not share in the light themselves. They were outside of life entirely, prisoners of a half-existence that was neither death nor true living. Their bodies, such as they were, had become strange and terrible things. They were not truly invisible, for they could be seen by those with the right kind of sight. The elves could perceive them dimly. One who wore a ring of power could see them clearly. Their tall, pale forms robed in grey, their faces white and haggard and terrible, their eyes like pits of malice burning with an inner fire. But to ordinary mortals, they appeared as nothing more than empty cloaks, dark robes moving without any visible wearer. They could still interact with the physical world when they chose. They could ride horses, those poor beasts driven mad by fear and forced to carry such riders. They could wield swords and daggers, terrible weapons ined with dark enchantments. They could speak with voices that could be heard, though those voices were like the hissing of wind through dead leaves, cold and empty and full of ancient malice. But they were not truly physical anymore. A sword could hurt them, could damage the form they wore in the visible world. but it could not kill them. Fire could drive them back, could scatter them, but it could not destroy them. Even drowning in the ford of Bruin, as happened when they pursued Frodo across the misty mountains, could not end them. They always reformed, always returned, always came back to serve their master. They were bound to the One Ring, you see. As long as it existed, they existed. Their fate was tied to it utterly, their being dependent upon its power. Only the destruction of the ring itself could finally release them from their endless servitude. Of all the 9, one stood above the rest. He was their lord, their captain, the greatest and most terrible of all the Nazgul. He was the Witch King of Angmar. We do not know with certainty who the Witch King was in life. Some scholars believe he was one of the Enedad Men lords, perhaps a prince of the royal house itself, a man of tremendous natural power who sought to rival Sauron before falling under his domination. Others suggest he was a great sorcerer from the distant east, a master of dark arts who had already delved deep into forbidden knowledge before the ring found him. The truth is lost to history, buried beneath millennia of shadow and service. What we know is that he was greater than the others. Some spark of his original ambition seemed to survive his transformation, some shadow of the will that had made him mighty among men. While the other 8 Nazgul became utterly subservient, instruments of Sauron's will with no independent purpose, the Witch King retained a measure of initiative, a capacity for strategy and hatred that set him apart. This is why Sauron gave him a task of his own. In the year 1300 of the Third Age, more than 1,000 years after the first defeat of Sauron at the hands of the Last Alliance, the Witch King appeared in the north of Middle-earth. He came in secret, cloaked and hidden, and he established a realm in the frozen lands beyond the misty mountains. He called this realm Angmar, the Iron Home, and from there he began a war that would last for nearly 700 years. His enemy was the Dee-Nadain of the north, the descendants of the same En-Men-Reen bloodline that had once defeated Sauron. They had established 3 kingdoms, in the north Arthedain, Cardolan, and Rudor. Together, these kingdoms might have been strong enough to resist him, but they were divided, quarreling among themselves over borders and succession and ancient grievances. The Witch King exploited these divisions with cunning and patience. He conquered Rudor first, corrupting its lords and turning them into his puppets. He sent his servants to spread plague and despair in Cardolan, weakening its people and destroying their will to fight. And then, with his full strength, he turned against Arthedain, the last and greatest of the northern kingdoms. The war was long and bitter. The people of Arthedain fought with desperate courage, knowing that they faced not merely a mortal enemy, but something far worse. Their kings called upon the elves for aid, called upon their distant kin in Gondor, called upon anyone who would help them resist the shadow from Angmar. Some aid came, though never enough. The elves of Rivendell and Lindon sent warriors. Ships from Gondor arrived with soldiers and supplies. But the Witch King was patient, and his resources seemed endless. In 1974, Arthedain fell. The capital of Fornost was taken, its people slain or scattered, its king killed in the final desperate battle. The Dee-Nadain of the north were destroyed as a political power, reduced to wandering rangers guarding lands that no longer acknowledged their authority. But the victory was not complete. An army arrived from Gondor led by Ejida Rinna, a prince of that southern kingdom. This army joined with the elves of Rivendell and the remnants of Arthedain's forces, and together they marched against Angmar. The Witch King met them on the plains before his fortress. Confident in his power, certain of his triumph. He was wrong. The battle was fierce and bloody, but the forces of the west prevailed. The armies of Angmar were shattered, their human soldiers slain, their orc allies scattered. The Witch King himself was forced to flee, his realm destroyed, his centuries of careful planning undone in a single day. Irunur, flushed with victory, pursued the Witch King across the battlefield. He wanted to face the Lord of the Nazgul in single combat, to prove his courage against the most terrible enemy in all the north. But as he rode forward, the Witch King turned, and Idaranno's horse reared in terror, refusing to carry its rider any closer to that figure of dread. Glorfindel, an elf lord of Rivendell who had fought in the wars of the First Age and had been sent back to Middle-earth after his death in Gundlin, called out to Eärendil. "Let him go," Glorfindel said. "Far off yet is his doom, and not by the hand of man will he fall." It was a prophecy, spoken in that moment of victory, a glimpse of things yet to come. The Witch King heard those words, and he remembered them. He fled the north, returned to Mordor, and waited for his master to rise again. But he did not forget Ura. He did not forget the humiliation of his defeat, and he did not forget Glorfindel's words. Years later, after Eärendil had become king of Gondor, the Witch King sent him a challenge. He dared Eärendil to face him in single combat, mocking the king for his cowardice at the Battle of Fornost. Eärendil, proud and foolish, accepted the challenge. He rode to Minas Morgul, the fortress that had once been Minas Ithil before the Nazgul took it, and he was never seen again. With Eärendil's death, the line of the kings of Gondor ended. The kingdom was ruled thereafter by stewards, capable men who governed in the name of kings who never returned. This was the Witch King's revenge, his answer to the defeat at Fornost. He had not merely killed a king, he had ended a dynasty. He had broken something that could not be mended, and still he waited. For 1,000 years more, he waited in Minas Morgul, lord of the Nazgul, servant of the shadow, patient as only the deathless can be patient. He waited for the One Ring to be found. He waited for Smarston to return to full power. He waited for the final war that would either enthrone Sauron as lord of all Middle-earth or destroy them altogether. Now let me tell you of the hunt, for this is the part of the tale that touches most closely upon the events that you may have heard of, the great war that ended the Third Age and broke the power of Sauron forever. In the year 3017 of the Third Age, Sauron learned a name that had been hidden from him for 60 years, a name that more to him than all the names of all the kings and lords in Middle-earth. The name was Baggins, and the place was Shire. Gollum, that wretched creature who had possessed the ring for 5 centuries before losing it to Bilbo, had been captured and tortured in the dungeons of Barad-dûr. Under torment, he revealed what he knew: the ring had passed to a hobbit, a small creature from a land called the Shire, a creature named Baggins. Sauron immediately dispatched his most trusted servants to recover his precious ring. All 9 of the Nazgul were sent, led by the Witch King himself. They crossed the Anduin, passed through the Gap of Rohan, and made their way north toward the Shire. Their mission was simple: find the ring, kill whoever possessed it, and bring it back to their master. The Nazgul rode on black horses, beasts bred in the shadow of Mordor, faster and stronger than ordinary horses, but equally maddened by the presence of their riders. They moved with terrible speed, crossing distances that would have taken ordinary travelers weeks in a matter of days. And as they rode, they spread fear before them like a plague. People who saw them on the road were struck silent with dread. Animals fled at their approach. The very land seemed to darken where they passed, as if the shadow they carried was a physical thing that blotted out the light. They were seeking, always seeking, their senses to the peculiar light of the ring. Their will bent entirely upon finding their prize. They reached the Shire in September of that year, and there they began their hunt in earnest. The hobbits of the Shire had never seen anything like the Nazgul. They were a peaceful people, concerned with the small pleasures of daily life, with good food and comfortable homes and the gentle turning of the seasons. The great affairs of the world had never touched them, shielded as they were by the rangers of the north and by their own obscurity. Now suddenly, the darkest servants of darkest power in Middle-earth were riding through their lanes, stopping at their doors, demanding information with voices like the hissing of serpents. They found Frodo Baggins, the nephew of Bilbo, who had inherited the ring 60 years before. But Frodo had been warned, and he was already fleeing, guided by strange friends, toward Rivendell, where he might find safety and counsel. The Nazgul pursued him across the Shire, across the old forest, across the Barrow Downs where ancient evil still lingered. They were always close behind, always just out of reach, their presence a constant weight of terror. pressing down upon Frodo and his companions. At Weathertop, the ancient watchtower of the North Kingdom, the Nazgul caught up with them at last. It was night, and the hobbits had made camp upon the hill, seeking the shelter of the ruined walls. They did not know that the Nazgul could sense the ring from miles away, that they had been leading their hunters directly to all along. When the Black Riders appeared, climbing the slopes in the darkness, there was nowhere to flee. 5 of them came that night, the Witch King among them. The other 4 remained below, cutting off any retreat. They closed in upon the small camp, their drawn swords gleaming with a pale light that was not the light of the moon. They spoke no words, made no threats. They simply approached, inexorable as death itself, and then Frodo put on the ring. It was a mistake, a terrible mistake born of panic and desperation. The ring whispered to him, promised him safety, promised him invisibility. He believed its lies. But when he vanished from the sight of his companions, he became visible to the Nazgul in a way he had not been before. They saw him clearly, a bright flame in the shadow world, the ring upon his finger blazing with a light that called out to them across the barrier between worlds. The Witch King struck. His blade found Frodo's shoulder, a Morgul, knife enchanted with all the dark arts of Minas Morgul. A shard of that blade broke off and remained in the wound, a sliver of frozen malice working its way slowly toward Frodo's heart. If it had reached its destination, Frodo would have become a wraith himself, a lesser creature bound to the will of the Nazgul, a slave of the ring rather than its bearer. But Aragorn arrived with fire, and the Nazgul fled before the flames. Fire could not destroy them, but could hurt them, could drive them back. They retreated into the darkness, content to wait. The Morgul blade was doing its work. Soon enough Frodo would be theirs. He was not. Through tremendous courage and the healing skills of Arund, the shard was rued and Frodo was saved. The Nazgul's first attempt to capture the ring had failed. But they did not despair. They were patient as their long centuries of servitude had made them. They knew that the ring would call to them, would betray its bearer, would find its way back to their master eventually. All they had to do was wait and watch and be ready. I have spoken much of the Witch King, for he was the greatest of the 9, and his deeds are best recorded in the histories. But let me say something now of the others, those 8 nameless servants whose identities have been lost to time. Of these 8, only one is named in any surviving Recacumple, the Shadow of the East. Camkul was second only to the Witch, king in power and authority. He was said to have been a king of the Easterlings, a lord of vast realms beyond the Sea of Ron, where men had worshipped Morgoth even in the elder days. He was a sorcerer before he received his ring, skilled in dark arts that gave him power over the minds of others. After his transformation, these abilities were amplified, making him the most perceptive of all the Nazgul. It was Camkul who came closest to capturing Frodo in the Shire. He rode to Bag End on the very day that Frodo departed, and spoke with Sam Gamgee's father, the Gaffer, asking questions about Baggins in that terrible hissing voice. Had he arrived a few hours earlier, the quest might have ended or it truly began. But fate, or perhaps a higher power, decreed otherwise. And Frodo escaped by the narrowest of margins. After the Witch King's defeat at the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, Cum became the lord of the remaining Nazgul. He led the others in the final defense of Mordor, commanding them from the Tower of Barad-dûr as the armies of the west approached the Black Gate. But his reign was brief. When the ring was destroyed in the fires of Mount Doom, Camkul perished with his fellows, his ancient spirit finally released for the bondage that had held it for thousands of years. Of the other 7, we know almost nothing. They are shadows of shadows, names lost even to legend. We know that 3 were lords of Endrû Menna, corrupted by Sauron during the years of his captivity in that doomed land. We know that others came from the south, from Harad and perhaps from lands even further beyond. We know that they possessed individual abilities and characteristics. For the Nazgul were not entirely interchangeable despite their servitude. Some were said to be more sensitive to the presence of the ring than others. Some were more powerful in combat, their skill with weapons preserved from their days as mortal warriors. Some retained fragments of the sorcerer's knowledge they had possessed in life, making them particularly dangerous opponents for any who faced them. But the details are lost, swallowed by the same darkness that consumed their names and their identities. What we do know is that they rode together, hunted together, killed together. They were a fellowship of evil, bound by the same chains, driven by the same master's will. When one suffered, they all suffered. When one was driven back, the others remained alert and watchful. They coordinated their efforts with perfect efficiency. Communicating through means that mortal beings could not perceive, responding to their master's commands as though they were extensions of a single mind. And they were terrifying. The fear they inspired was not merely psychological. It was magical, a spell woven into their very nature by the power of those they wore. The Black Breath, it was called. And those who fell under its influence lost all hope, all will to resist. Strong men became as frightened children in the presence of the Nazgul. Brave warriors dropped their swords and fled rather than face them. Even the horses of Rohan, the finest steeds in all of Middle-earth, would not approach them willingly. This fear was their greatest weapon, more effective than any sword or sorcery. It went before them like a herald announcing the coming, weakening their enemies before battle was even joined. It was the breath of the shadow itself, the cold touch of the tome, the whisper of endless despair. And against it only the sagest hearts could stand. Now let me tell you of the war, the final war. The great conflict that would determine the fate of all Middle-earth. Sauron had rebuilt his strength in the long years since defeat at the hands of the last alliance. Mordor teamed with orcs, with trolls, with men who had sworn their service to the Dark Lord. The time had come to destroy Gondor, the last great realm of men in the west, and to sweep away all resistance to his dominion. The Witch King was given command of this assault. He mustered the armies of Mordor at Minas Morgul, that cursed fortress that had once been a beacon of light, and had become a den of shadows. Tens of thousands of warriors gathered at his command, orcs from the mountains and the pits, Easterlings from beyond Ron, Haradrim from the south with their great war elephants, men of Khand and Umbar, and a dozen other nations that had fallen under Sauron's sway. It was the greatest army that had marched since the War of Wrath, and the Witch King led it in person, riding at the head of his host upon a great black horse that screamed with madness. The siege of Minas Tirith was terrible. The city was defended desperately by the soldiers of Gondor, but they were vastly outnumbered. Wave after wave of enemies crashed against the walls, and though the defenders held for a time, they knew that they could not hold forever. The Witch King directed the assault with cold precision, identifying weaknesses, exploiting gaps, pressing always forward. And then came Grond. It was a battering ram, massive beyond all precedent, its head forged in the shape of a great wolf. It had been built in the forges of Mordor for this specific purpose, to break the gates of Minas Tirith, which had stood inviolate for 1,000 years. 100 mountain trolls dragged it forward, their strength amplified by dark sorcery. Beside them marched the witch, speaking words of power, laying spells upon the great ram to give it strength beyond the mere force of its impact. 3 times Grond struck the gates. 3 times the gates held. The 4th time they shattered, and the Witch King rode through. Picture him, if you can, in that moment of triumph. His black robes billowed behind him, untouched by any wind that mortal men could feel. His horse screamed beneath him, its eyes rolling with terror despite the spells that held it to its task. A crown of iron sat upon his invisible head, and in his hand he held a sword that burned with a pale fire. No living man had ever stood against him and survived, and no living man stood against him now. The defenders of the gate fled before him, not because they were cowards, but because the black breath fell upon them like a weight, crushing their courage, filling their hearts with despair. They could not face him. No mortal man could face him. He was invincible, unkillable, a force of nature rather than a being that could be fought. Only one man stepped into his path. Gandalf the White, mounted on Shadowfax, the greatest of all horses. I stood before him there, in the gateway of Minas Tirith, and I challenged him. I called upon him to go back, to return to the shadows, to leave this place that he could not enter. And for a moment, just a moment, he paused. What passed between us in that moment, I will not describe in detail. Some things are too terrible to speak of, even in the safety of a warm fireside. Suffice to say that we knew each other, the Witch King and I. We had been enemies for many ages of the world. We had fought before, in other places, at other times, and we both knew that this confrontation would be decisive. But we were interrupted. From the north came the sound of horns, clear and bright in the morning air. The riders of Rohan had arrived, thousands of cavalry sweeping down from the hills like a tide of thunder. The siege was broken, or at least its inevitable victory was no longer assured. The Witch King turned from me, turned from the gate he had broken, and rode out to meet this new threat. What followed was the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, the greatest battle of the Third Age. And what followed was the doom of the Witch King, the fulfillment of Glorfindel's ancient prophecy. King Theoden of Rohan led the charge himself, though he was old and weary, and knew that he might not survive the day. He was a good king, Theoden. He had been deceived by Saruman's agent, had been used as a puppet while his realm decayed around him. But he had found his courage again at the end, had shaken off the lies and the weakness, and had come to Gundor's aid with all the strength that Rohan could muster. He knew what he was riding toward. He knew that the Nazgul were upon the field, that the Witch King himself led the enemy's forces. He knew that he might die. He rode anyway, because that was what honor demanded, because that was what his people needed, because some things are more important than survival. The Rohirrim smashed through the lines of the enemy, scattering orcs and Easterlings before them. For a time, it seemed as though victory was possible, as though the tide had truly turned. But then the Witch King descended. He rode now upon a horse, but upon a fell beast. One of those terrible flying creatures that the Nazgul had acquired somewhere in the mountains. It was a thing of nightmares, a leathery, winged monstrosity that stank of death and decay. Upon its back, the Witch King was a lord of the air, untouchable by any earthly weapon. He saw Theoden and marked him for death. The fell beast struck the king's horse, and Theoden was thrown down, pinned beneath his dying mount. The Witch King descended to finish him, confident in his invincibility, remembering Glorfindel's prophecy, not by the hand of man will he fall. What had he to fear from this dying king, from any of these mortal warriors who scattered before him like leaves before a storm? But Theoden was not alone. Dernhelm, who had ridden beside the king throughout the charge, dismounted and stood between the Witch King and his prey. Dernhelm was a small warrior, slender, seemingly insignificant compared to the Lord of the Nazgul. But there was something strange about this warrior, something that the Witch King's wraith sight could not quite perceive. He commanded Dernhelm to leave, to flee while there was still time. No living man could hinder him, he said, confident in the prophecy that had protected him for so long. And Dernhelm laughed. The warrior removed the helmet, and long golden hair spilled out, shining in the morning light. It was not Dernhelm at all. Lilwyn, the niece of King Theoden, a woman of Rohan who had disguised herself as a man in order to ride to war. She was no man, and she did not fear him. "I am no man," she said, and the words struck the Witch King like a physical blow. For the first time in millennia, he felt something that might have been fear. He struck at her with his mace, shattering her shield and breaking her arm. But before he could deliver the killing blow, a small figure darted forward and stabbed him from behind. It was Merry the Hobbit, wielding a blade from the Barrow Downs, a blade that had been forged in Arnus, specifically to fight against the Witch King of Angmar. The blade was enchanted, bound with spells that could harm even a wraith, and it found its mark between the Witch King's crown and his mantle. The Nazgul Lord screamed, a sound that no mortal throw would have produced, a shriek of agony and disbelief. And, in that moment of weakness, Lawin drove a sword into the space where his face should have been. the Witch King of Anmar was destroyed. His robes collapsed, empty, as whatever had animated them finally departed. The iron crown rolled away across the field. The fell beast died with him, its unnatural life dependent upon the will of its master. And across the battlefield, a cry of despair went up from the servants of Mordor as they felt their greatest champion fall. Not by the hand of man will he fall, Glorfindel had prophesied, and so it proved. He was brought down by a woman and a hobbit, two beings that the great and terrible Witch King had never considered worthy his attention. The overlooked and the underestimated had accomplished what armies and kings could not. There is a lesson in that, I think. The mighty often fall because they cannot imagine that anything small or humble could pose a threat to them. They look past the servants and the children and the women, dismissing them as irrelevant, never seeing the courage and the determination that burns in hearts that they consider beneath their notice. This blindness is the weakness of tyrants and would-be gods, and it brought low even the Lord of the Nazgul. With the Witch King's fall, the remaining 8 Nazgul lost their lord and captain. But they were not destroyed, not yet. They remained servants of Sauron, still bound to his will, still potent instruments of his malice. Camul assumed command, as I mentioned before. He led the other 7 in the defense of Mordor, in the final desperate efforts to stop the armies of the West from reaching the Black Gate. They rode their fell beasts over the hosts of men and elves and dwarves, spreading terror and death wherever they passed. Many brave warriors fell before them in those final days, but their time was running out, while armies clashed before the gates of Mordor. 2 small hobbits were climbing the slopes of Mount Doom. Frodo and Sam, the ring-bearer and his faithful companion, had survived everything that Mordor could throw at them. They had crossed the dead marshes and the plains of Gorgoroth. They had endured hunger and thirst and the constant pressure of Ring's malice. And now, at the very end, they were within reach of the fire where the ring had been forged. Sauron sensed them. In a moment of terrible clarity, he realized where his enemies truly were, what their true plan had been all along. He was not fighting a war of conquest. He was fighting a war of distraction, and he had been fooled. He sent the Nazgul to Mount Doom, all 8 of them, riding their felled beasts at desperate speed, racing to intercept the hobbits before they could reach the crack of doom. But they were too late. They were always going to be too late. The quest of the ring had reached its conclusion, and nothing in all the world could stop it now. Frodo stood at the edge of the fire, the ring upon his finger. For one terrible moment, it seemed as though he would claim it for himself, as though the quest would fail at the very threshold of success. But Gollum was there. Gollum who had followed them through all of Mordor. Gollum who wanted the ring more than anything else in the world. He bit it from Frodo's hand and fell with it into the fire, and the ring was destroyed, and the Nazgul perished. It was instantaneous. One moment they were racing toward the mountain, their fell beasts shrieking with unnatural speed. The next moment they simply ceased to be. Their bodies, such as they were, dissolved into nothing. Their spirits, bound for millennia to the power of the ring, were finally released. What happened to those spirits, I cannot say. Were they condemned to some final darkness, some eternal punishment for the evils they had committed? Were they granted rest at last, the peace that had been denied them for so long? Were they simply annihilated, their souls extinguished along with the ring that had sustained them? I do not know. These are mysteries beyond even my understanding. What I know is that they were gone. After thousands of years of servitude, thousands of years of terror and darkness and despair, the 9 were no more. The most terrible servants of the Dark Lord had been destroyed, not by armies or great heroes, but by the destruction of the thing that had given them their terrible existence. And now, my friend, as the fire burns low and the night deepens around us, let me share some final thoughts on the fate of the 9 lords who became the Ringwraiths. Their story is a tragedy in the true sense of that word. They were not born evil. They were not created as monsters. They were men, mortal men, who made a choice. A bad choice, a terrible choice. a choice born of pride and fear and the desperate desire to escape the fate that all mortals must eventually face. But it was to the choice. They took the rings freely, accepted the power freely, bound themselves to Sauron of their own will. We might pity them, I suppose, trapped for millennia in a half-existence, stripped of everything that had made them who they were. Slaves to a will not their own. There is something pitiable in that fate, something that stirs compassion even for beings that committed terrible crimes. They suffered, and suffering deserves acknowledgement, even when it is suffered by the guilty. But we should also remember what they did while they were suffering. The wars they waged, the people they killed, the fear they spread. The Witch King alone was responsible for the destruction of entire kingdoms, the deaths of countless innocent people. Whatever compassion we feel for what they endured, we cannot forget what they inflicted on others. And we should remember the warning that their fate represents. The desire for immortality is a dangerous thing. Men are not meant to live forever. That was not the gift that Ringwraiths gave to the race of men. He gave them something else, something that even the elves sometimes allure, the freedom to leave the world, to pass beyond its circles into a mystery that even the Valar do not understand. This gift was called the doom of men in ancient times, but doom did not always mean what it means now. It meant judgment. Fate, the thing appointed by the Creator. It was not a curse but a blessing, though few in their fear and sorrow can see it as such. The Nine Lords could not see it as a blessing. They saw only the loss, the ending, the darkness of the grave. And in their fear, they reached for something that promised to save them from that fate. They found instead a fate far worse than death, an existence that was neither life nor rest, a slavery that endured long past the point where death would have been a mercy. Let their fate be a lesson, then. Death is not the worst thing that can happen to us. There are worse fates than the ending of life, worse destinies than the distortion of the body. To live forever as a slave, to endure eternally without hope or joy or love, to be stripped of everything that makes existence worthwhile, and left with nothing but endless service to an evil will. This is what the Nine found when they tried to escape their mortality. And so we come to the end of our tale, dear friend. The fire has burned down to embers, and outside the window, the first grey light of dawn begins to touch the sky. The Nine are gone, destroyed along with the ring that made them what they wore. Their long nightmare is over, and whatever awaits them now, it cannot be worse than what they endured for those endless centuries. I hope that this tale has not troubled your sleep too greatly. There is darkness in it, yes, but there is wisdom too. The wisdom of understanding what we fear, of naming the shadows so that they lose their power over us. The wisdom of knowing even the most terrible enemies were once like us, and fell because of weaknesses that we all share. Sleep now if you can. Rest, and let the memories of the Nine fade into mist of dreams. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges, its own choices, its own opportunities to choose light over darkness, courage over fear, mortality over the terrible immortality of the Wraith. Remember, dear friend, all we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us. The Nine made their choice, and it destroyed them. May your choices lead you to a better fate. Good night. Sleep well. And if you dream of shadows tonight, remember that shadows cannot exist without light. Where there is darkness, there is always the possibility of dawn. The tale is told, the fire sleeps, and so should you. Rest now in the peace that the Nine never found. Sleep well. Good night.